Good morning, everybody. As we continue our series on young children being harmed by adults and proving to you all that it's not just an American problem, we are going to deal with a case out of Australia this time, and one which is still unsolved. Margaret Tapp and her daughter Seana, 9, were killed in their home in Victoria, Australia in 1984. Seana, the 9-year-old, was raped and strangled. Margaret was beaten and strangled. Their killer has never been caught. On August the 8th, 1984, Jim Rollins arrived at a home in Ferntree Gully, a suburb of Melbourne, Australia, to pick up his date Margaret for the opera. When no one answered the door and Jim realized that all the lights were out, he remembered the lock was broken on the back door. He let himself in and called out. He found his date, Margaret Tapp, tucked into bed. When Jim went to wake her, he noticed the strangulation mark around her neck and realized she wasn't sleeping. He could see her complexion was quite pallid, and he thought maybe she was sick. Margaret Tapp was killed the night before. After phoning the police and Margaret's sister, Jim suddenly remembered that Margaret's 9-year-old daughter, Seana Tapp, was supposed to be home as well. He entered her room to find the little girl also strangled in her bed. She had been the victim of what investigators have called a very sickening sexual attack. Both Margaret and Seana Tapp were neatly tucked into bed by the killer so as to look like they were asleep. The killer had used a rope to strangle them, and it was not found on the scene. Investigators found no evidence of forced entry or a struggle, nor did they find any unidentifiable fingerprints. Footprints from a pair of Dunlop Volley sneakers, a popular shoe at the time, were left on the floor of the home but were never identified. DNA was retrieved from semen on Seana's, but a decent sample could not be extracted for several years. A neighbor reported having heard a muffled cry around 11 p.m. on the night of the 7th. Their dog had also barked at something outside the home at around midnight, perhaps the killer making their escape from the Tapp home. Between this witness testimony and the fact that both victims were wearing night dresses, police determined that the murders had taken place very late on the 7th or early hours of the 8th of August. In addition, neighbors had reported seeing a red Ford utility vehicle parked near the house not long before the murders. The owner of the red Ford has never been identified. Margaret had worked as a nurse for many years and also attending law school part-time at the time of the murders, bringing her into contact with many people. She also had a very active social life and was known to have dated multiple men, including a couple of married men. In fact, the home where the murders took place had been bought for her by a doctor named John Bradker. She had a long-term relationship with him. When Dr. John Bradker died in a car accident a year before the murders, Margaret fought the doctor's widow for ownership of the house and was ultimately awarded half ownership, after which she bought the second half of the house out. In 2008, a man named Russell John Gesser was charged with the murders based on a DNA match. 2 weeks later, the charges were withdrawn when it was discovered that the DNA sample had been contaminated in the laboratory. Margaret's ex-husband, Don, was quickly cleared. The couple had a divorce free of acrimony. James Rollins, who discovered the bodies, was also cleared once the police questioned him. In this case, the problem really isn't a lack of suspects. With little physical evidence to go on and the sheer number of people Margaret and Seana both came into contact with, the police have a difficult time narrowing the list of potential perpetrators. But let's have a look at some of the ideas which were thrown around. 1. An angry wife. It's often theorized that a wife of the man Margaret dated might have gotten angry enough to commit the murders. Mrs. Bratker is the most obvious choice in this entire scenario. However, the theory doesn't match the facts. Besides, there being no evidence to implicate anyone in arranging a murder for hire, the sexual assault of Seana points to a sexually motivated predator. Secondly, a rejected man or spurned lover. Ian Cook was a family friend who had stayed with Margaret at the house once and had reportedly made unwanted romantic or sexual advances towards her. She later said that he had come on strong and she told him off. Margaret was also said to be taking driving lessons at the time, and her driving instructor was apparently attracted to her. When the police questioned him, he lied about having ever been in the Tapp home, where his fingerprints were indeed found. Since Margaret dated several men and wasn't committed at the time to any one of them, the idea of a jealous lover or rejected man committing the crimes has been one of the top theories in this case. Number 3, a troubled neighbor. Suspicions in the neighborhood quickly fell on a family that the community regarded as troublesome. Margaret, however, had hired one of the teenage sons to do some yard work for her, despite warnings from a concerned neighbor that the boy had a habit of making sexually suggestive comments to older women. Shauna Kettlewell lived on Calvin Drive when Margaret and Seana Tapp were murdered. She was the same age as Seana, shared the same name, albeit with different spelling, and went to Brownies just like Seana, although the two girls were in different troops. She believes the Brownies connection could be the key to solving the murders. 5 years ago, she attempted to investigate the murders herself, but was blocked when she attempted to look into people connected with Seana's Brownie troop. She said that there were people within the Brownie organization that were known to have had an unhealthy interest in the little girls that were their charges. The fallout in Seana's troop was horrible and devastating, she tells news.com.au. Brownies and guides are not as popular today, and the scouting movement in general is suspicious of outsiders. She explains, adding that even as a former member, she could not get any answers. Well, as we stand here today, this particular case is still unsolved. And my opinion, I think this is a very solvable case, and I get the feeling that it's one which maybe law enforcement, maybe the community does not really want solved. I think it was a targeted attack, and therefore no one else feels like they are in danger. And I think with that kind of information and all the usual suspects, it's rather hard to understand why no one has been arrested and found guilty yet. Anyway, we will come back to this case. I think there's a lot more intrigue and all kinds of things which can be dug up, and we are certainly going to try and do so. Okay, my dears, until we meet again on the next one, please take good care of yourselves, your children, your pets, and each other. Bye.